Hello and welcome back to the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Today we want to continue on with our project, Miss Kelly. First of all, I want to make sure that I clear up any misunderstandings. This is not my design. I mentioned in the very first episode for this series that this is a pattern that was created by Erin Russek, and I purchased her pattern and I'm creating the center box of her quilt, center block rather, of her quilt. The whole quilt is called My Tweets and the center section is called Miss Kelly, and that's what we're working on. So just in case there are any misunderstandings, and I have put all of the contact information for Erin in the comments now and the description of all the videos on this project, just so there's no confusion about that. So let's pick up kind of where we left off. And since we visited last time, I have added the green leaves and the stems on the piece. And when I sat down to pin those on, the pieces that I had were so close to each other, they were almost touching each other. And to be able to place the pieces exactly where the pattern said, I was having to fold in the edges where the leaf meets the stem. And I sewed a couple of those on like that, and I just really wasn't happy with it. It didn't have the kind of quality finish that I was looking for. So I started realigning those leaves to the stem, and I have them sewn on now what I think is the way they should be. Looking at it from my angle here, it looks like they're not even. So what I'm going to do in just a few minutes is we're going to take it down and put it on the light box and see if those two sides match up reasonably well to each other. And if they don't, then it'll have to come off and be redone. I'm hoping that we're close enough that it doesn't, and it's just an optical illusion how it looks here. But I want to talk just a little bit about next steps on the quilt, like we always do. If this is able to stay as it is, we're pretty much finished with everything at the bottom except for those 4 leaves that go on the vase. And then there's a couple of leaves that go here that we may have to adjust the size just a little bit. And then from there, the only thing left are some leaves and 3 little flowers and then some other leaves in this section of the quilt. And that's what I started working on. You see I have one put together here. And I think I did mention on the last video that I taped that I was a little concerned about the little dip in all the pieces, and I said that if that becomes very problematic or if it's very troublesome to get it so those are bent in, we may just eliminate it. I kind of went halfway. They've got a little dip in the pieces. I'll pull one out, but they're not a true heart shape. And I think that's close enough for what we need. And they fit in here really well. And then the center piece, I did something just a little bit different with that. And let me tell you about that. For this center piece, what I did was I combined 2 different techniques for getting a piece of fabric ready to applique on a quilt or any type of project. I have done these before where you stitched around the circle and then you drew it up tight and pressed it so that it would hold the shape, and then you could take the piece in the middle out. What we're doing now with this project is we're using the starch base to put on the fabric and then use the iron to fold it in place. This one I did both. I stitched around it, I pulled it tight, and I pressed it. Then I put a little bit of starch right on that edge and pressed it again until it dried. And that was the trick because it pressed it really nice and firm and flat, but it's definitely going to stay. And I'm going to clip that little gathering string and pull the template out And you can see I still have what is nearly a perfect circle. It is still very well pressed in place, and it's ready to go on the next flower. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert here some close-up work of creating one of these flowers. I have one done, and I'm going to do another one. I have the pieces all cut out. I just need to starch and press those and fold them to get them in place. So we're going to look at that now. Okay, so now I am making the pieces to go into a orange flower that we're going to put on our design. I'm using the same starch mix that I first started this project with. At the time I said that the starch would probably last, and I don't remember how long, a week or two, but I've been using the same starch for almost 2 months now. Every time I use it and I'm done with it at that session, I close it up tightly, and it does stay in a room that's air conditioning, so it stays pretty cool and it's airtight, and it's still working just fine. You really use very little starch in this process. Now, each one of these fabric pieces I have cut probably less than 1/4 of an inch bigger than the template that is cut out for each one of these petals. And then I place the starch all around in the fabric on the outside of the template. And then I use my fingers to fold that fabric over onto the back side of the template. I'm using the awl to allow me to grab a hold of smaller portions of fabric than I could do with my fingers. And then each time I pull a section over, I place the mini iron on it to kind of steam it in place. And as it dries, that starch holds it and it takes the shape of the template. I will caution you that even this mini iron is very hot and it will burn your fingers. So be cautious when you're using that. On this piece, I noticed that there was a place that the fold had become a point in the fabric. So I'm using the awl to readjust the fabric so it folds over the curve instead of making a point. And then once I get the back side pressed, I'll turn it over and press the front. And now that first piece is completed. This one has a little bit of a high side on one side of the petal, so I can kind of tell which petal that is in the design. Sometimes you can tell a difference and sometimes you can't. For these, I think they're pretty much all interchangeable. If you decided to rotate the flower slightly, it would not make much of a difference. But I am trying to match them up size and shape as closely as I could. And I did make only one set of 5 template pieces. I did not make a template for every petal individually for every flower. This video is running real time. It took me about 9 to 10 minutes to do all 5 petals. You see here I'm working on the second petal, and I have that just about finished. I did have a little bit of a point on this one as well. One more press with the iron. And a perfect fit. Now to the third piece. A little bit of the starch goes a pretty long way. The wetter you get it, the more ironing you have to do to get the fabric to dry. Your goal should be have enough so that it will take the shape of the template and stay in place, but not so much that it is difficult to get it dry and makes it too firm with the starch. Again, be very careful when you have your fingers that close to that iron, because they will burn. I've noticed that it's very hot when I use it, and I do get a little splash of steam. I have not noticed, because I have tried to be very careful, that it burns my fingers enough that it will make a blister, like if you are taking a pan into or out of an oven and you touch the rack, you'll get a little blister where you burn it, or get a little mark. I haven't noticed that the steam is doing that, but it is quite hot, and if you get it too close or you touch it, you may get the mark or the blister. We've got 3 petals finished. We're working on the 4th one now. Trying to get all those curves down and get that little dip in the center of the flower as much as we can. As we talked about before, we're not going to spend an enormous amount of time trying to get that dip, but it would be nice that it had a little bit of shape to it. And again, after you press it on the back side where you're folding the fabric around, you want to turn it around and press it on the front side. I find what that does is it presses the piece down so it's thinner. If you only press on the back side, I find you have a little bit of height in the piece that you're working on, and by pressing it on the front, it really creases that fabric and allows the piece to sit more flat on your background fabric. And now this is the last petal that we're working on. You'll notice that iron is trying to slip away. It's up on a table and then a board on top of that table, so the cord kind of pulls it down. You want to make sure when you're using it that you've got it someplace that you can keep an eye on it, and that the cord is not pulling it off of your surface. I'm using that awl to get a little bit better shape. Another one of those little points. If you take tiny little bites when you're making those turns, the turn will be very smooth. The larger piece of portion that you're trying to fold over, the more likely you're going to get a sharp point instead of a curve. And flip it over. And we're going to put it in place. Now, what you'll notice on some of these pieces is because we've allowed the fabric to fold over on the pointy edge that goes underneath the center of the flower, sometimes they're too long. And what I recommend is getting it together, putting it in place, and then seeing if you need to trim it. You will not always need to trim it, but if you do, you'll probably need to take it out of take the template paper out of the fabric and then trim it. And you want to trim just a little bit because you don't want to get it too short. Then you'd have to start over again. So you see this one is trimmed just so the fabric goes to the center of the flower. So we'll have to be careful that we are able to place it so that it touches the center flower. And it can be rather difficult to keep all those petals in place, so I've got a tip on an upcoming video of how to handle that. So I hope that was helpful in seeing how those pieces are done. They're relatively small pieces, like I said, 1/2 inch by 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch by 1 inch, pretty small. And it does get a little fiddly. I use my awl when I'm working with those to try to keep my fingers out of the way, but inevitably my nails will get pretty close to that iron, and it is hot and it will burn you, so please be careful. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to finish these yellow flowers for one side and get them pinned and put on the quilt top. And I don't know if you noticed or not, initially I was going to use the pure orange fabric for the centers, which would be a little closer to what's in the illustration here on the pattern. But I decided to go with this. This is what I'm using as my medium orange. And it's a cute little pattern, and it's not quite as dark as the orange. And I thought it would look a little bit better as opposed to doing this dark orange for those flowers, and get a little bit more screen time, so to speak, for this fabric. So I did change that up just a little bit. The other thing I'm going to do is in the pattern there are 3 leaves that sit here and 2 that sit right here. And I'm going to be doing a couple of things with those. First of all, I'm going to cut them a little bit smaller than the pattern says. And when I say smaller, what I mean is just when I trace it on the template paper, I'm going to cut inside the line instead of outside the line. So very, very, very little difference. But then I'm going to step back, like I was explaining with the little circles, and kind of combine techniques, because the most difficult thing for this particular piece and project so far has been the leaves. Not the birds, not the bird feathers, the leaves. Because when you're doing the starch basting the way I've been doing it, is I was creating those leaves and leaving the tails out, kind of like you do when you do EPP. And with EPP, that tail nestles behind another piece. In Applique, there may not be another piece like there is here. So what I'm going to do, just for an example, here's one of the pieces for the leaves. And you can see they're pretty sharp points with the very little distance here between those points, meaning it's a sharp point versus a more of a 90 or 70 degree point angle. So I'm going to try something different, and what I'm going to try to do is to clip the fabric fairly close, no more than 1/4 of an inch at the very most, and fold that fabric in. I'm going to turn it this way. Turn that fabric in on the point, and then fold the points, or the sides rather, in to get a sharper point with no tails. And I think that I'm going to have to do that by using a combination of the processes. And I think what's going to work best is, number one, trimming it a little closer. Heavens to Betsy, you got to know you can't trim it too closely, because if you do, your fabric starts fraying. And that was a bit of the problem I had with the leaves that I just sewed on, is that trying to get that fabric tucked in under that leaf, the more you touched it, the more you moved it, the more the fabric started fraying. So that became even more difficult. But I'm going to trim it a little closer. I'm going to fold it over and press it. Then I'm going to use my stitching method to stitch down both sides and be able to pull it tight and gather that fabric together to get kind of a dry fit. Is it going to work? Do I have it trimmed close enough that all the ends of the fabric are underneath, but there's not so much fabric that it's a bunch of fabric together and they're going to lay flat. And then once I get that, I can dab it with the starch, press it again, and it should hold. So we're introducing a little bit of a different technique just to see if that works better. Because if I had a huge project and there were a bunch of these leaves and I did them the way I did this, I would never tackle it. It's too difficult. It's too fiddly. You're sitting there with a needle trying to sew those pieces on the background. You want to try to do it in one swipe if you can, because you really don't want to have to take it off and pull the threads out, because that just makes the fabric fray more. So that was a bit of a problem. So we're going to try to do it a different way and see if that works better for us. So that's where we are. We are getting fairly close to the end. I think that there are a lot of pieces in these little flowers. So I think that maybe by the next time we meet, I'll have one set of flowers on one side done and maybe partially through or getting ready to start on the second set of flowers. But we are getting really close to being to the end of the applique work on this quilt. Like I said, we've got 4 leaves here, 4 leaves, I'm not sure here, a couple of leaves up here, 3 flowers, and then some leaves. And we also still need to sew the comb and the beak on the birds. So we're getting there. I think I would guess if I had to put a number on it, 75% done with the applique, which is pretty good. I think we've been out this about 2 months, and in 2 months to come from a stack of fabric and a pattern this far in, and it's pretty good. It's really pretty good, at least in my estimation, based on how I am sewing and quilting and the amount of time that I can devote to it. So that's where we are. I want to thank you for joining me today in the Shamrock Quilt Studio. Know that we have at least one new video every week on the project that we're working on right now. That's the applique project, Miss Kelly. I've got some thoughts in my head about the next project we do, which will be a machine sewn strip quilting or strip piecing quilt top. So we're going to depart from our handwork that we've been doing for a while and go into machine piecing, because that is much faster. It's a little bit different process that we do, and it'll be something different to enjoy. So we hope to see you the next time here at the Shamrock Quilt Studio. If you like our videos, please like us and subscribe to our channel. You may not know it, it doesn't cost a penny to subscribe. I'm not charging anything for the videos, and I'm not selling you anything at this time. I'm here to show you what I'm sewing on and give you the opportunity to see how those things are done, some of the processes that I use that may be different from other people. And hopefully within that you would learn something, or if you have something to share with me, please do so. Leave me a comment at the end of this video. We'll see you next time. Thanks for stopping by.